What if every belief you hold, every idea you have, and even your sense of right and wrong were not born with you at all, but slowly shaped by experience? In the 17th century, John Locke challenged centuries of tradition by claiming that the human mind begins as a blank slate and that governments exist not by divine command, but by the consent of ordinary people. His ideas would overturn absolute monarchy, influence modern democracy, transform education, and redefine what it means to be free, setting in motion changes that still shape the world you live in today. John Locke was born on August 29, 1632, in the small English village of Rington during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. The country stood on the edge of political and religious conflict that would soon erupt in a civil war. Questions about authority, monarchy, religion, and individual freedom divided society deeply. Into this uncertain world came Locke, whose ideas would later help redefine government, education, human understanding, and the very meaning of liberty itself. His father served as a lawyer and had fought on the parliamentary side during the English Civil War against King Charles I. This political background exposed young Locke early to debates concerning power and legitimate authority. Unlike earlier generations raised under unquestioned monarchy, Locke grew up witnessing a society struggling to determine whether rulers governed by divine right or by the consent of the people. These experiences quietly shaped the intellectual concerns that would later define his philosophy. Locke received his early education at Westminster School in London, one of the most rigorous institutions of the time. There he studied classical languages, rhetoric, logic, and ancient philosophy. Education during the 17th century emphasized memorization of traditional texts. Yet Locke gradually became dissatisfied with scholastic methods that relied heavily on inherited authority rather than observation. Even as a student, he showed preference for practical inquiry over abstract speculation. In 1652, Locke entered Christ Church College at Oxford University. Oxford remained deeply influenced by medieval Aristotelian philosophy, which dominated European education for centuries. Students learned established doctrines concerning nature and metaphysics, largely through commentary rather than experimentation. Locke found this intellectual atmosphere restrictive. While he fulfilled academic requirements, his genuine interests moved toward emerging scientific developments transforming Europe. During his years at Oxford, Locke encountered the new experimental philosophy inspired by figures such as Francis Bacon and later advanced by scientists like Robert Boyle. These thinkers promoted observation, experimentation, and empirical investigation rather than reliance on tradition. Locke became closely associated with members of what would eventually become the Royal Society, a group dedicated to scientific inquiry grounded in experience. This environment profoundly influenced his intellectual development. Originally trained in medicine, Locke studied anatomy, chemistry, and physiology, working alongside prominent physicians. Medical study reinforced his belief that knowledge must arise from careful observation of natural processes. The human body itself became evidence that understanding grows through experience rather than theoretical assumption. Although Locke never practiced medicine extensively, medical training shaped his philosophical method for life. A decisive turning point occurred in 1666 when Locke met Anthony Ashley Cooper, later known as the Earl of Shaftesbury. This encounter transformed Locke's career. Shaftesbury recognized Locke's intelligence and invited him to join his household as personal physician and advisor. Through this relationship, Locke entered the center of English political life. Shaftesbury was a powerful political figure advocating constitutional government and opposition to absolute monarchy. Living within Shaftesbury's household exposed Locke directly to political crisis, economic policy, colonial administration, and debates about religious tolerance. Philosophy for Locke was never detached speculation. Political instability surrounding succession to the English throne raised urgent questions concerning the limits of governmental authority and the rights of citizens. Locke began developing ideas that would later form the foundation of liberal political theory. During these years, Locke also turned serious attention toward understanding human knowledge itself. Conversations with friends convinced him that many philosophical disputes persisted because people failed to examine the limits of human understanding. Rather than arguing endlessly about truth, Locke proposed first investigating how the mind acquires ideas. This project would eventually become his greatest philosophical work. He rejected the long-accepted belief that human beings are born possessing innate ideas placed within the mind by God or nature. Philosophers had assumed concepts such as morality or logical truth existed naturally within every person. Locke challenged this assumption directly. Observing children and individuals from different cultures, he concluded that knowledge develops gradually through experience rather than existing at birth. According to Locke, the human mind begins as a blank slate, later described through the Latin expression tabula rasa. Experience writes upon this empty surface through sensation and reflection. Sensory experience introduces information from the external world, while reflection allows the mind to observe its own operations, such as thinking, doubting, and believing. All complex ideas arise from combinations of these simple experiences. This claim carried revolutionary consequences. If knowledge originates from experience, then authority based solely on tradition loses justification. Education becomes central to human development because individuals are shaped by environment rather than predetermined ideas. Human differences reflect experience and circumstance rather than fixed intellectual hierarchy. Political tensions in England soon intensified, placing Locke himself in danger. Shaftesbury's opposition to royal policies eventually led to accusations of treason. When his patron fell from power, Locke became politically suspect due to close association. In 1683, fearing arrest, Locke fled England and sought refuge in the Netherlands. Exile proved both personally difficult and intellectually productive. Living among Dutch intellectuals in a relatively tolerant society allowed Locke to refine his philosophical and political writings without immediate censorship. During this period of displacement, he composed major works addressing government, religious tolerance, and human understanding. The experience of exile reinforced his conviction that stable society requires protection of individual rights and freedom of belief. By the late 1680s, England again faced political transformation. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 replaced King James II with William and Mary under conditions limiting royal authority and strengthening parliamentary government. Locke returned to England shortly afterward, bringing with him manuscripts that would profoundly influence modern political and philosophical thought. The stage was now set for Locke's ideas to emerge publicly, ideas that would challenge absolute monarchy, redefine knowledge, and help shape the intellectual foundations of modern democracy itself. After returning to England following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, John Locke entered the most influential period of his intellectual life. The political transformation that placed William and Mary on the English throne created an environment more receptive to ideas concerning constitutional government and individual liberty. The revolution itself had established an important principle: that monarchy could be limited and political authority could exist under law rather than divine right. Locke's philosophical writings emerged at precisely this historical moment, giving theoretical foundation to changes already unfolding in English society. In 1689 and 1690, Locke published the works that would permanently secure his place in intellectual history. Among them was an essay concerning human understanding, the result of nearly 20 years of reflection. In this work, Locke attempted something unprecedented. Instead of asking what reality ultimately is, he investigated how the human mind forms knowledge and where the limits of understanding lie. His goal was practical as much as philosophical. Many disputes in religion and politics, he believed, persisted because people claimed certainty about matters beyond human comprehension. Locke began by rejecting the doctrine of innate ideas, which had dominated philosophical tradition for centuries. If ideas were truly inborn, he argued, They would appear universally among all people regardless of culture or education. Yet observation showed clear variation in beliefs across societies. Children and individuals unfamiliar with philosophical reasoning displayed no awareness of supposedly universal principles. Therefore, knowledge must arise through experience rather than birth. He described the mind at birth as empty of content, gradually filled through interaction with the world. Sensation provides information about external objects through sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Reflection allows the mind to examine its own internal activities such as thinking, willing, remembering, and doubting. From these two sources emerge all human ideas. Even the most abstract concepts ultimately trace back to combinations of simpler experiences. Locke carefully distinguished between primary and secondary qualities of objects, an idea that deeply influenced later philosophy. Primary qualities such as shape, motion, and number exist independently within objects themselves. Secondary qualities such as color, taste, and sound arise through interaction between objects and human perception. This distinction suggested that reality as experienced may differ from reality as it exists independently, introducing subtle skepticism about perception while maintaining confidence in empirical investigation. At the same time, Locke turned his attention toward political philosophy in what became his most famous political work, Two Treatises of Government. Written partly during exile but published after the Revolution, the text directly challenged theories defending absolute monarchy. Earlier political thinkers had argued that kings ruled through divine authority inherited from biblical tradition. Locke rejected this claim entirely. He proposed instead that political authority originates from individuals themselves. In a hypothetical state of nature, human beings exist as free and equal individuals possessing natural rights. These rights include life, liberty, and property, not granted by government but inherent to human existence. Government arises only when individuals collectively agree to form political society for mutual protection of these rights. This idea transformed political thought. If government exists through consent, then rulers who violate natural rights lose legitimacy. Citizens retain the right to resist or replace governments that become destructive. Political power becomes conditional rather than absolute. Locke's arguments provided philosophical justification for constitutional rule and later inspired revolutionary movements, seeking independence from oppressive authority. Property occupied central importance in Locke's theory. He argued that individuals gain ownership by mixing their labor with natural resources. When a person cultivates land or produces goods through effort, those products become legitimately theirs. Property therefore results from human activity rather than royal grant. This concept strongly influenced emerging economic thought and later capitalist theory. Equally significant was Locke's defense of religious tolerance. Europe had endured generations of violent religious conflict between competing Christian denominations. Locke believed coercion could never produce genuine belief because faith depends upon internal conviction rather than external force. Governments should therefore protect civil order while allowing individuals freedom of worship. Separation between political authority and religious conscience became essential for peaceful society. Despite advocating tolerance, Locke's views reflected limitations of his historical context. His arguments primarily addressed Christian sects and did not always extend equally to all religious groups. Nevertheless, his defense of freedom of conscience marked a major step toward modern ideas of religious liberty. During the 1690s, Locke also contributed extensively to educational theory. In some thoughts concerning education, he applied empirical psychology to child development. Since the mind begins shaped by experience, education becomes decisive in forming character. Locke emphasized discipline balanced with encouragement, practical learning over memorization, and cultivation of reason through gradual habit. Children should develop self-control and curiosity rather than fear authority blindly. His educational ideas influenced generations of reformers who viewed learning as preparation for rational citizenship rather than mere transmission of classical knowledge. The belief that environment shapes intellectual and moral development would later become foundational within modern pedagogy. Throughout this productive period, Locke remained physically fragile. Chronic illness limited his activity, leading him to spend extended time in rural retreat at the home of Lady Damaris Massam, a close intellectual companion. There he continued writing, revising essays, and corresponding with thinkers across Europe. His reputation steadily expanded beyond England as translations spread his ideas internationally. By the turn of the 18th century, John Locke had become one of the defining voices of the Enlightenment. His philosophy united empirical science, political liberty, religious tolerance, and educational reform under a common principle. The human progress depends upon understanding experience rather than submitting blindly to authority. Yet the full consequences of his ideas were only beginning to unfold, as future generations would apply his theories far beyond the circumstances in which they were first written. As John Locke entered the later phase of his intellectual life, his influence was already spreading quietly across Europe, though he himself lived far from political ambition or public spectacle. Unlike many thinkers who sought power or controversy, Locke preferred reflection, correspondence, and careful revision of his ideas. Much of this period was spent at Oates in Essex, the country home of Sir Francis Massam and his wife Damaris Massam, an intellectually gifted woman deeply engaged in philosophical discussion. The environment offered Locke stability and calm after decades shaped by political danger and exile. From this peaceful setting, Locke continued refining the philosophical system that increasingly defined Enlightenment thought. His essay concerning human understanding sparked widespread debate among scholars, theologians, and scientists. Some praised his empirical approach as liberating philosophy from centuries of speculation, while others worried that grounding knowledge entirely in experience threatened religious certainty and moral stability. Locke responded patiently to critics, publishing revised editions that clarified misunderstandings and expanded arguments concerning perception, language, and belief. One of Locke's growing concerns involved the misuse of language in philosophical and political disagreement. He observed that many conflicts arose not from genuine differences in reality, but from confusion created by words themselves. Abstract terms such as substance, essence, or authority were often used without clear meaning, allowing disputes to continue endlessly. Locke argued that careful examination of language could prevent intellectual error. Words, he insisted, represent ideas formed through experience, and when language becomes detached from clear ideas, confusion follows. This attention to language anticipated later developments in philosophy that would treat communication itself as central to understanding thought. Locke believed intellectual humility required recognizing how easily humans mistake verbal certainty for genuine knowledge. Philosophical progress, therefore, depended not only on discovering truth, but also on recognizing the limits imposed by human cognition. Meanwhile, Locke's political ideas continued gaining importance within England's evolving constitutional system. The principles outlined in two treatises of government gradually shaped debates about parliamentary authority, legal rights, and governance. Although Locke rarely engaged directly in public political conflict after his return from exile, policymakers and reformers increasingly drew upon his arguments defending consent and limited government. Across the Atlantic, his ideas began influencing English colonies in North America. Colonial thinkers studying natural rights and legitimate authority found in Locke a powerful justification for political autonomy. His claim that governments exist to protect life, liberty, and property resonated strongly within societies distant from centralized royal control. Though Locke himself could not foresee future revolutions, his philosophy quietly prepared intellectual foundations that would later inspire demands for independence and democratic government. Locke also continued reflecting on religion, seeking reconciliation between faith and reason without allowing either to dominate completely. In The Reasonableness of Christianity, he argued that the essential teachings of Christianity were morally simple and accessible rather than dependent upon complex theological systems. Religious belief, he suggested, should encourage ethical conduct and social harmony rather than doctrinal conflict. By emphasizing moral practice over dogmatic precision, Locke hoped to reduce sectarian division that had devastated Europe for generations. Yet his commitment to tolerance remained grounded in political practicality as well as philosophical principle. Societies fractured by enforced belief could not achieve stability. Freedom of conscience allowed peaceful coexistence among individuals holding different convictions. Locke envisioned civil government as protector of external peace, leaving inner belief beyond political control. Despite intellectual success, Locke's health steadily declined. Years of respiratory illness and physical weakness limited travel and public engagement. Nevertheless, correspondence connected him with leading thinkers of the age. Scholars from France, the Netherlands, and Germany sought clarification of his theories, recognizing his work as central to the emerging Enlightenment emphasis on reason guided by experience. During these later years, Locke increasingly reflected on human identity and personal continuity. One of his most influential philosophical contributions concerned the nature of the self, rather than defining personal identity through the soul or physical substance. Locke proposed that identity depends upon consciousness and memory. A person remains the same individual over time because of continuous awareness connecting past and present experience. This psychological account of identity introduced questions that would shape future debates in philosophy, law, and psychology. His analysis suggested that responsibility and moral accountability depend upon conscious awareness rather than metaphysical essence. The self becomes dynamic rather than fixed, shaped through experience and recollection. Such ideas would later influence discussions about punishment, responsibility, and human development. By the early 18th century, Locke had witnessed extraordinary transformation within England. Absolute monarchy had given way to constitutional balance. Scientific inquiry expanded rapidly. Religious conflict gradually softened under growing tolerance. Though many forces contributed to these changes, Locke's philosophy provided intellectual structure, helping societies understand why freedom, education, and empirical knowledge mattered. Living quietly in the countryside, he observed these developments with cautious optimism. Progress, in Locke's view, did not arise from sudden revolution, but from gradual improvement guided by reason, education, and respect for individual rights. His life had moved from civil war through exile to relative stability, mirroring the broader transition of Europe toward Enlightenment ideals grounded in human experience rather than inherited authority. As age advanced, Locke prepared for the final stage of life with characteristic moderation, continuing intellectual work while withdrawing gently from public controversy, leaving behind ideas that would soon reshape not only philosophy, but the political destiny of entire nations. In the final years of John Locke's life, the pace of public debate surrounding his ideas continued to grow even as he himself withdrew further into quiet reflection. Living at Oates under the care and companionship of the Massam family, Locke spent his remaining time organizing manuscripts, revising essays, and corresponding with scholars who increasingly regarded him as one of the defining thinkers of the age. His health had long been fragile, and advancing illness limited physical activity, yet his intellectual clarity remained remarkably strong. By this stage, Locke had witnessed the gradual acceptance of principles that once appeared politically dangerous. Constitutional monarchy had stabilized England following decades of turmoil. Parliamentary authority expanded. Religious persecution lessened compared to earlier generations, and scientific inquiry flourished under empirical methods closely aligned with Locke's philosophy. Though he rarely claimed credit, his writings helped provide justification for these transformations by explaining why authority must rest upon consent and why knowledge must arise from experience rather than tradition alone. Locke's later reflections increasingly returned to practical questions concerning human happiness and moral conduct. He believed philosophy should ultimately improve life rather than remain abstract speculation. Human beings pursue happiness naturally, yet often misunderstand its source by chasing power, wealth, or reputation without cultivating rational judgment. True freedom, he argued, lies not merely in absence of restraint, but in the ability to guide one's actions through reasoned choice. Education, therefore, remained central throughout his thought, shaping individuals capable of governing themselves responsibly within society. His theory of government continued spreading beyond England, influencing political thinkers throughout Europe and the American colonies. The idea that legitimate authority depends upon protection of natural rights slowly transformed political imagination. Rulers were no longer viewed simply as divinely appointed figures, but as trustees responsible to the people they governed. Locke's arguments offered moral justification for resistance against tyranny while avoiding advocacy of chaos or violent instability. Government existed to secure peace and property, and when it failed in that purpose, reform became justified. Equally enduring was Locke's contribution to epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. By insisting that human understanding possesses limits, he encouraged intellectual modesty at a time when religious and political certainty often justified conflict. Knowledge grows through observation, correction, and shared inquiry. Error becomes inevitable, but also instructive. This outlook supported the emerging scientific spirit that valued experimentation over unquestioned authority. In discussions of religion, Locke maintained his lifelong commitment to tolerance. He believed sincere belief could never be forced through law or punishment. Faith belonged to the private realm of conscience, while government concerned itself with civil order. This separation helped shape modern concepts of religious freedom and pluralistic society. Though imperfectly applied in his own era, the principle marked a significant departure from centuries of enforced uniformity. As his strength declined, Locke approached mortality with calm acceptance similar to the moderation reflected throughout his philosophy. Friends and visitors described him as thoughtful and composed, continuing conversation about theology, ethics, and human understanding even during physical weakness. He spent increasing time reading scripture and reflecting quietly, not in fear, but with philosophical serenity shaped by a lifetime devoted to inquiry. On October 28, 1704, John Locke died peacefully at Oates at the age of 72. According to accounts from those present, his final moments were marked by clarity and tranquility rather than anxiety. He was buried nearby in the village churchyard, far from the political centers his ideas had profoundly influenced. After his death, Locke's impact expanded far beyond anything visible during his lifetime. Enlightenment thinkers across Europe adopted his empirical philosophy as foundation for scientific and educational reform. Most dramatically, his political theory crossed the Atlantic, shaping the intellectual framework of the American Revolution. Concepts of natural rights, government by consent, and protection of liberty appeared directly within foundational political documents of emerging democratic nations. Modern liberal democracy, constitutional governance, individual rights, and educational psychology all bear the imprint of Locke's thought. His vision of the human mind, as shaped by experience, influenced later philosophy, psychology, and social theory. By challenging innate hierarchy and emphasizing development through environment and learning, he contributed to evolving beliefs about equality and human potential. John Locke's legacy rests not in dramatic personal events, but in the quiet transformation of ideas. He redirected philosophy toward human experience, replaced unquestioned authority with investigation, and argued that political power must serve individuals rather than dominate them. His work helped shift civilization from inherited certainty toward reasoned freedom. The world that followed increasingly assumed principles Locke had struggled to articulate, that individuals possess rights independent of rulers, that belief cannot be compelled, and that knowledge advances through experience shared across generations. In this way, Locke's life became part of a broader movement redefining humanity's understanding of freedom, responsibility, and the nature of understanding itself, leaving behind a philosophical inheritance that continues shaping modern society long after his voice fell silent.